Thursday, excuse me, March 21st. No, excuse me. We were just doing the agenda for next week. It is not spring today. This is Thursday, March 14th. I got a week ahead of myself. So we're taking up S-295, which is the bill having to do with recovery of damages from major polluters. No better way to put it. And I wanted to start by thanking the Agency of Natural Resources and the Treasurer's Office for their constructive engagement in this process. It's nice to feel like you're on the same side. So I thank you. After using time during our break to consult with many other interested parties, the administration has provided a number of proposed markups for our committee to consider. I believe most of these changes will improve the bill, and those proposals are reflected in the draft that Michael Grady has prepared for us. And those changes include integration of the administration and treasurer's resilience implementation strategy into the bill, changes to expand the definition of types of climate change adaptation projects and qualifying expenditures the fund can cover, expansion of the covered period from 1995 to 2023, adding a streamlined opportunity for responsible parties to administratively appeal cost recovery demands at the agency level, which is a more robust opportunity in the civil division of the Superior Court, which should safeguard due process for lowering ANR's administrative burden. Including an interim report back to the legislature, something I understand that the Treasurer's Office also supports, and I'll say more about shortly. Including an appropriation for a limited service staff position and a budget for hired consulting services to support this work. We understand from ANR that there were concerns about the tight timeline for implementation, and rather than remove those timelines altogether as ANR proposed, I will suggest that we push the timeline out to hopefully reach some compromise with both to make sure that we eventually get where we all want to be, but to give the Agency of Natural Resources time. As introduced, the bill would require ANR to adopt implementing rules by July 1, 2025. This draft moves that date to July 1, 2026, and also gives ANR the year plus they testified they need to adopt their resilience implementation strategy and require that by July 1, 2025. After hearing from Treasurer Pichek, I also propose affording the Treasurer additional time to complete Section 3, the cost report, so that the cost report comes after and can be informed by the resilience implementation strategy. This means instead of January 15, 2025, we would look at the cost report due no later than January 15, 2026. With the inclusion of ANR's proposed January 15, 2025 interim report back to the legislature, the legislature, the treasurer, and the agency will then have this extension would give the agency, the legislature, the treasurer, an additional legislative session in which to make any improvements to the program ANR may recommend in the interim report before it initiates the rule required by the bill. I'm hopeful that we can strike a reasonable compromise with all, and that we can move forward with a bill that's supported by both this committee as well as the administration. That's the goal. Mike, if you wouldn't mind, I kind of described where we're at, and then I see where this is draft 1.3 that's on your
This is Michael Grady with Legislative Council. As the chair just stated, you should be looking at draft 1.3 with a 3/13/2024 date and a 7:33 p.m. Timestamp. I won't summarize the changes because I think the chair just did them all. So I will start going through specific changes and an overview of what is in draft 1.3. Short title in section 1 remains the same as the Climate Superfund Act. There are definition changes in the new chapter 10 VSA 24A, the Climate Superfund Cost Recovery Program. There's a change in who is the agency. It had previously said that the agency was the Climate Office, not the Agency of Natural Resources. This just is a broader definition, so it is whomever the secretary is going to assign this work to. There is a change that you will see throughout the draft. Previously, the definition in subdivision 2 was climate change adaptive infrastructure project. And you will see throughout that has been changed to climate change adaptation project. You had some discussions in your last meeting about this, this definition and what it makes eligible for cost recovery payments and future use. You had indicated that you wanted it to be available for home buyouts, and that was added as a potential eligible project on line 16. In addition, you had indicated that you wanted it to be eligible to pay for crop loss, and that was added on page 2, line 6. The other eligible projects have remained the same, but you will see later on how they're going to be tied to the strategy that the agency is currently working on and will become part of this bill. The program is the program that we are discussing. Coal, the definition has not changed. Control group for the purposes of what is a corporate entity is not changed, and cost recovery demand has not changed either, but let's just look at that again. It's a charge asserted against the responsible party for cost recovery payments under the program for payment to the fund. And then you go to what is a covered greenhouse gas emission. It means the total quantity of greenhouse gases related into the atmosphere during the covered period. From the use of fossil fuels extracted or refined by an entity. It previously said extracted, produced, refined, or sold, and Megan O'Toole from the agency noted that for consistency with who are the covered entities, who are extractors or refiners, that this term really should be extracted or refined. So I made that change. Page 3, line 5 and 6. In what is the covered period, as the chair indicated earlier, and is proposed by the agency, I believe, and the advocates, the covered period is expanded from January 1, 1995 until December 31st, 2023. It had previously been December 31st, 2019. So it is no longer, you don't have that, oh, it's so far in the past retroactively. It goes just, it's a year retroactive potentially, and also retroactive until 1995. Moving on, definition of crude oil has not changed. An entity has not changed. Environmental justice focused population, that reference has not changed. You will see later on in the bill a requirement to consult with the EJ focused populations as the committee discussed previously. Fossil fuel has not changed. Fossil fuel business has not changed. Fuel gas has not changed. Fund has not changed. Greenhouse gas has not changed. Nature-based solutions has not changed. In the notice of cost recovery demand, There is an addition, it's really just clarifying that the demand means a written communication from the agency, not just any written communication, informing a responsible party of the amount of the cost recovery demand payable to the fund. Definition of petroleum product has not changed, program has not changed. Qualifying expenditure has changed, but from my perspective, it's really a clarifying amendment from the agency. It means an authorized payment from the fund, to pay reasonable expenses associated with the administration of the fund and the program as part of the support of a climate change adaptation project, including its operation, monitoring, and maintenance.
In other words, the polluter would be paying, not the taxpayer.
That is correct. It's from the fund, and what goes into the fund
Right.
are those cost recovery payments. And another thing that it does here is that later on, or in the bill is introduced, operation O&M costs were in another definition. It moves O&M into what's a qualifying expenditure, because you just want all of those costs for that implementation and administration of the project to be kind of wrapped up in under one term. Moving on from there, you have a definition of responsible party. The change here really is that what they are responsible for are those emissions during the covered period. It had not previously said that. And then the last amendment, new amendment, it refers to the A&R resilience implementation strategy adopted by the agency. Then you get to the program itself. It establishes the
Sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you a question about the definition earlier on the home buyouts piece?
Sure.
I understand that might be something nuances get worked out in the rulemaking process, but for these home buyouts, would that be for houses that are at risk of flood damage or climate change damage, or would it be after the fact when there's been damage? And
well, it's an interesting question, because I think it ties in to the agency's strategy under resilience implementation and what they're going to identify as what it needs to be done to adapt and respond and plan for future climate events. So I have not seen the strategy or a draft of the strategy. I think it probably will address issues of that kind, but you should ask the agency that specifically.
Yeah, there's the next witness.
thank you.
The agency.
As a quick kind of follow-up to that, the way this is drafted, would it allow, do you think, for sort of the rebuilding of homes? So if my home is bought out, but I live in Chittenden County where there's a less than 1% or 2% vacancy rate, the town or the county might need to engage in home building to make it so I have a place to go.
So it does allow for repair to negative impacts caused by climate change, and it does allow for assistance to households and businesses in preparing for future climate change. So maybe a hardening of a structure. So I do think that the definition is broad enough to allow for that. And again, when we walk through further changes in the bill, you see how the strategy will come in as to what gets funded, and the strategy could address those types of concerns.
In many low-lying areas in the south particularly, they have houses built, the first floor is really on stilts.
Yeah.
And I suppose something like that could happen. It'd be unusual in Vermont, given our weather. We don't really want that. But, there are ways to deal with some of it, but you know, I have areas in my district where people have houses that continually flood, even in minor storms. And, you know, if they had the opportunity to get a buyout and be able to move, same constraints that you're talking about, I think they would take that. But they just, they can't. And during Irene, there was swift water rescue for some of those folks.
Yeah, we had a lot in this last flood too, and I think in Senator Hashim's district, they actually moved a whole bunch of housing out of the floodplain and built affordable housing elsewhere, and I just want to make sure that type of movement is possible under this
Barbara, I
language.
wanted to know one other thing that I think we skipped over right on page 1, Mike, if we can go back there, and that's the natural communities, human and natural communities, was an important addition from the agency in my view, because that would include wildlife habitat and so forth.
Yeah, correct, and I'm sorry that I did.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure that that was identified as I thought, a major change from the agency.
Okay. So you are on page 5, and you'll see the establishment of the program. Key parts of the program is to secure compensatory payments from responsible parties based on strict liability to provide a source of revenue. Program obviously is going to determine its proportional liability of the responsible parties, collect payments, post recovery demand, and then develop, adopt, implement, and update the strategy, that resilience strategy that is defined in the definitions that will identify and prioritize climate change adaptation projects, and then disperse those funds. And here's where you get that link to the strategy: disperse funds to implement climate change adaptation projects identified in the strategy. So what the strategy comes up with, the projects that I think you heard Secretary Moore say that they are identifying as on the ground projects that can go to address these concerns, they will be able to disperse funds for those projects. Should I move on?
Yeah, please.
So you're now on page 6, you're in the liability of the responsible parties. They're strictly liable, remain strictly liable for share of the cost of climate change adaptation projects and all qualifying expenditures as that is defined in the definitions. And it also includes those entities in a control group, those corporate entities with their structure and the amount of their employees, and they will be treated as a single entity, and they're jointly and severally liable for payment of any cost recovery demand owed by any entity in the control group. And then you come to the language. This is how the proportionate share, the share is apportioned to each responsible party. This is all highlighted, and that's because in the drafts and the input from the multiple parties, this language changed back and forth a little bit, but frankly, it hasn't changed that much from what the bill was when it was introduced. Let's just walk through this very closely. This is how the costs are apportioned. So the demand, which is going out to the responsible party, shall be equal to an amount that bears the same ratio to the cost to the state of Vermont and its residents as calculated by the state treasurer pursuant to section 599C of this title. Remember, the state treasurer was going to do a report on what the cost to Vermont is of the emissions of greenhouse gases, the covered emissions. I moved that report into statute. It had previously been in session law, but I think you want that report in statute because, first of all, it's now being referenced to something that the state treasurer is calculating. And you might want to amend that report in the future. You might want updates on that report in the future, and to have it in statute is something that's transparent for future legislation. So that's a major change, bringing that report into statute. So remember, an amount that bears the same ratio to the cost to the state of Vermont and its residents as calculated by the state treasurer from the emission of covered greenhouse gases during the covered period as the responsible party's applicable share of covered greenhouse gas emissions bears to the aggregate applicable shares of covered greenhouse gas emissions resulting from the use of fossil fuels extracted or refined during the cover period. So you figure out what that responsible party's ratio, their share of covered greenhouse gas emissions is to the aggregate, the whole of the use of fossil fuels extracted or refined, and that ratio becomes the ratio for the cost to Vermont, state of Vermont and its residents for the purposes of the cost recovery demand.
So what does that mean exactly, Mike?
So
If we spend
they're-
$100 million,
if they
they're
were-
gonna give us $100 million?
No, if they were 5% of the covered greenhouse gas emissions of the aggregate as a whole, they're gonna be 5% of the costs to Vermont and its citizens in the cost recovery.
As determined by the treasurer.
Right.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
And well as administrative costs, as we did in the earlier.
Right, the qualifying expenditures, right?
And that structure is based on previous sort of similar, like the chemical and, or is it totally different?
It's different.
Okay,
It's different. So, and I can explain how it's different if you would like.
I don't think
I think.
I need you to.
So generally with Superfund, the hazardous waste liability, the enforcer goes after one party, usually one party with the biggest pockets. And then it's up to that party to go figure out how they're gonna get the proportionate share from all of the other responsible parties. It's called contribution actions. It's like the enforcer of the state goes after the one biggest responsible party, gets their compensation, and then it's up to that responsible party to go out and seek compensation from
That's
the
what we're
other.
trying to.
You're not doing that here. You're basically apportioning that liability through this ratio, so you don't have to have these.
Okay.
I just want to mention that.
So simplified.
Well, yeah, but it's also important to recognize who we're going here.
Mhm.
This is not, for example, when I was chair of the Bennington Select Board back in the 1980s, our landfill became a Superfund site. So we had responsible parties. And they were required to put in, but then they went after anybody that put anything in the landfill. And the one that I remember the most that stuck out at me was a garbage man who had one truck, who passed away, and they went after that one asset, one garbage truck, to try to, what's a garbage truck worth? I don't, back in the day, before we had all those fancy stuff on. But they went after that out of state, and it was really bothers me to this day that they could do that. This avoids that.
Okay, that is helpful context. Thank you.
So moving on, there's a change in how to deal with a responsible party that owns a minority interest in another responsible party. And then I think this is great clarifying language. It's like the responsible party still has their share, but their share will be increased by their applicable share for that minority interest that they own. So they're going to get a cost recovery demand for their 5% plus their share of that minority interest of that other responsible party. Then you move on to what the agency will use for the purposes of determining the amount of covered greenhouse gas emissions attributable to any entity. Bills introduced had US EPA's emissions factors for greenhouse gas inventories. The agency wants to be able to use the best available, publicly available fossil fuel volume data, and that was added in. So they have some flexibility to what they can use in determining the amount of covered greenhouse gas emissions. And then the agency gets to adjust the cost recovery demand amount of a responsible party who refined petroleum products or who is a successor in interest if the responsible party establishes to the satisfaction of the agency that a portion of that demand was attributable to refining of crude oil extracted by another responsible party, and the crude oil extracted was accounted for in another cost recovery demand. That's not changed, but that just gives the responsible parties some ability to say, hey, we shouldn't be liable for this cost because it's already been paid by someone else. So then you get to the timing, right? And the chair referenced this earlier. There was some discussion among the interested parties about what the timing would be. So the agency shall issue the cost recovery demands not later than 6 months following the adoption of the rules required in subdivision 599A(b)(2). So that subdivision requires those rules by July 1, 2026. And then there's, so that is when 6 months from there would be January 1, 2027. And that would be when the first cost recovery demand would be issued.
I just have a question. So I know that we expect litigation on this, and I'm wondering if pushing out the effective dates will make that take longer, or because does my question make sense? Like if our first cost demand is now not until 2027, is that at the point that we would expect?
No, you're probably going to get some litigation just on the merits, the constitutional merits on its face, and
Okay.
the court won't wait for implementation.
Okay.
But there, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Sometimes where is litigation, there isn't what's called a ripe issue for the court to look at. I think, but ripeness has exceptions, one of which is if the constitutionality on the face of the legislation. I think you will likely see the parties who are opposed to this raise on the face facial
Mr.
constitution.
Attorney General is committed to defending the state. You remember the testimony earlier in the discussions.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that the pushing out of the effective dates wasn't going to make that now take longer,
Right,
but I feel comfortable it won't.
Senator Norris.
So tell me how this works, Mike. When the Secretary's office issuance of the cost recovery demand, to who?
To one of the responsible parties, one of those extractors or refiners who have regulatory contacts with the state and that were responsible for a share of the greenhouse gas emissions during the covered period.
So once the Treasurer's office comes up with a lump sum or whatever, there's not like a pool of money, and I was under the impression that the Secretary would Agency of Natural Resources would issue it directly to the Treasurer's office.
No, the demand is going to go to the responsible party, the extractor or the refiner. And then that money goes into a fund,
right,
which you could say the treasurer administers, but you've said that it's going to be administered by the secretary, A&R. Okay. And they will pay out for those adaptation projects and qualifying expenditures for climate resilience and mitigation.
okay. There, as for the 6 months comes in then, because
Yeah.
we want to be, okay.
Right, so you get the rules, and then they have 6 months to issue. So they go out January 1, 2027, and then you give the responsible party the ability to have some installment payments, frankly. So page 8, a responsible party may elect to pay the cost recovery demand in 9 annual installments. The first installment shall be paid not later than 6 months following the secretary's issuance of the demand. And each subsequent demand is.
We're on page 9 now.
Yeah, each subsequent, page 8, each subsequent.
Oh, okay, I was, sorry. So basically, the treasurer puts together an amount, let's say it's $100 million. And then you say this company was responsible for 5% of that 100 million, and that's what the agency would ask for.
That's correct, and effectively, and then that responsible party has time.
Would write a check and.
Or they could write a one-time check, or they could write multiple installments.
Does this preclude the community from also suing for damages?
No, there is language that's added in the bill, so it's a very good change. It says it doesn't take away any other common law or statutory rights that a person might have
So
to
I
seek
think that's
liability.
important to keep in mind, that it's the treasurer, just because the treasurer didn't put it in, that homeowner's loss could be, I mean, it's a long shot.
So,
But what happened in Bennington and North Bennington regarding Saint Gobain, it was both the public settled and expand, and the settlement was the expansion of the water lines, and then there was a private action to recover the cost of new wells and the costs of medical treatment, so.
and that specific language, the new language that was added on page 9, subsection 598A, 598J. Nothing in the section shall be construed to supersede or diminish in any way existing remedies available to a person of the state at a common law or under statute. So those remedies remain. One significant change in the draft is the appeal right of a responsible party who's aggrieved by an issuance of a notice of cost recovery demand. For the first thing they have to do is they have to exhaust their administrative remedies. It's just fairly normal for appeals, and they have to file a request for reconsideration with the secretary within 15 days following issuance of that cost recovery demand.
And they have to do it in Vermont.
Well, yes, I mean, this is, you get, and this is pretty, it's not, I won't say it's ubiquitous, but it's fairly common in some of the agency programs. When the agency issues a decision and somebody doesn't like it, you get to appeal, because the decision, is usually by agency staff, right? And so the person who's aggrieved can then say, hey, I want the secretary to reconsider that decision. And so it's an internal within the agency appeal. So that has to occur in Vermont. And then if that, once the secretary issues a final decision on that reconsideration, by issuing a subsequent notice of cost recovery demand, and then the responsible party has an action under Rule 74 of the Vermont Rules of Civil Procedure to go to the Superior Court in Washington County. You may remember that previously the appeal was that it was going to be held as a contested case hearing, and any appeal from a contested case hearing goes right to the Vermont Supreme Court. This does not do that. This is, you're going to keep that appeal in kind of the normal appeal route by going to the Superior Court first. You're going to specify that's going to be in Washington County because that's where the agency is located, etc.
Senator Shima.
Thank you. My question was regarding the 15 days and how you landed on that number as being the amount of time.
It was proposed by the agency, I believe. I don't recall the other.
Agency's the next witness.
I'm trying to recall my knowledge of the one reconsideration program. I know pretty well, and I can't remember the days.
And so, yeah, I can follow up with A&R for that one, but the request for reconsideration, that's, like you were saying, just to clarify, that's different than appealing, right?
Right, it's basically within the agency appeal, and it's something that's pretty common. Like EPA has the same sort of administrative remedy. Some division of EPA issues a decision, and the aggrieved party said, no, I want to appeal that. And they have what are called environmental courts or environmental administrative decisions. And once you get that, then you can appeal. You have to, as this language says, you have to exhaust your administrative options, your administrative remedies. And so building that in, it helps, doesn't eliminate, it helps keep appeals out of the court system.
Thank you.
There is then the creation of the Superfund, the Climate Superfund Cost Recovery Program, Cost Recovery Fund. And it's administered by A&R, as I already indicated, to fund those climate change adaptation projects. It consists of the cost recovery payments, monies at time to time appropriated to the fund, and any other gifts, donations, or other monies received from any source. Say you win litigation later on or ongoing litigation, this fund could be a depository for litigation awards. It can only be used to pay qualified expenditures for climate change adaptation projects identified by the agency in the strategy. So you're back to the link to the strategy and reasonable administrative expenses of the program. It can also be used, and this is new, to implement climate adaptation actions identified in the state hazard mitigation plan.
Such as, what would that mean? Such as?
There's things like creation of floodplain, there's things like armoring, there's things like moving a road. You know, after Irene, like down on Route 4, they moved part of that road. You could probably, projects like that would be in that plan.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit. Then you get a report, on a report January 15, 2025, the agency, in consultation with the treasurer, submits a report to the General Assembly detailing the feasibility and progress in carrying out the requirements of the chapter, including any recommendations for improving administration of the program. Then you get the rulemaking. This is what the agency will need to adopt to implement the program. They have to have methodologies for using best available science and data to identify responsible parties and determine their share. They have to have requirements for registering entities that are responsible and issuing notices of cost recovery demand. They have to have the resilience and implementation strategy. And all of these things, nature-based solutions intended to stabilize floodplains, riparian zones, shoreline, practices to adapt infrastructure to the impacts of climate change, practices to build out early warning mechanisms, practices that support economic and environmental sustainability, criteria and procedures for prioritizing climate change adaptation projects. The agency consults with the Environmental Justice Advisory Council on coming up with a strategy. It consults with other state agencies and departments, assesses the adaptation needs and vulnerabilities of various areas. It identifies major potential proposed and ongoing climate adaptation projects, identifies opportunities for alignment with existing federal, state, and local funding, consults with stakeholders, including local government and advocates, and representatives of environmental justice focused populations, considers components of the Vermont Climate Action Plan that are related to adaptation and resilience, and then conducts public engagement in areas and communities that have most significant exposure. Then once every 5 years, the auditor evaluates the program for its effectiveness, makes recommendations to the agency, submits those results to the General Assembly. And then on page 13, line 16, you will see where the state treasurer's report on the cost of Vermont of covered greenhouse gas emissions has moved from session law into statute. On the report January 15th, after consultation with the agency's interagency advisory board to the Climate Action Office and with any other person the treasurer decides to consult with. The treasurer makes assessments and estimates required by the section, submits those to the General Assembly, and those assessments will be the cost to the state of Vermont and its residents of the emissions of covered greenhouse gases between that covered period, and include a summary of the various cost-driving effects, including effects on health, natural resources, housing, economic development, etc. We'll also include a categorized calculation of the costs that have been incurred and are projected to be incurred in the future within Vermont, and a categorized calculation of the costs that have been incurred and are projected to be incurred in the future to abate the effects of covered greenhouse gases between the covered period. Then you get implementation. A&R adopts the strategy on or before July 1, 2025. A&R adopts the rules on or before July 1, 2026. Remember, 6 months from then, the cost recovery payments go out. There is an appropriation to A&R in FY25, in addition to anything else that they are receiving. It's general fund for personal services for the position created in Section 5. So one 3-year limited service position is created in A&R for the purposes of implementing the act. So $300,000 for a 3-year position. And then Section 6 is, as the agency pointed out, the Secretary pointed out in the bill is introduced, there was a lack of an enforcement hook or tool for the agency in Section 6. Adds this program to the list of programs that A&R can use. It's a long list of enforcement tools for enforcement is appealable underneath this chapter itself. Any other act or decision of the Secretary that could be appealed is going to be appealed under the rules of civil procedure and not under appeals to the environmental division.
Are there any further questions from Mike about the redraft? Draft 1.3. I'd like to invite Maggie Gendron, and I hope I didn't mispronounce that name.
Okay, you came very close. It's Maggie
Very close.
Gendron.
Well, hold on. Deputy Secretary of the Agency. I'm sorry. Yeah,
How
please.
did you want me to do that?
I will make you co-host.
Okay.
You should be able to.
Now, is this discussion on the amendment?
So this discussion is actually, I was asked to come in to talk about environmental justice in terms of just the impacts of the environmental justice bill. But we also have our resident expert here to run some mitigation.
Well, that might be helpful. I'm on a time
Okay,
link here.
okay,
I'd really like to get the agency's response to our changes, to their changes,
sure,
to try to move forward.
sure.
Crossovers tomorrow.
Yeah.
I have to get the bill. If
Okay.
I get the bill out, I have to get it out tomorrow. I know you have a nice presentation.
Well, how about this? Let's just, you have the presentation posted online. I think I don't have to open up the presentation. I can summarize quickly the important
Why don't you
points.
summarize the presentation?
Yeah,
And how
Yeah. it does link to what some of our feedback would be to the.
Right, and then
Yeah.
I'd like to get to a discussion of the
Okay.
changes, and then hear from anyone else who
Sure.
wants to, and then try to get a vote on the bill.
Okay, so for the record, my name is Maggie Gendron. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm joined here today by Megan O'Toole, who runs the mitigation program for the Climate Action Office, and she's working closely with Secretary Moore on this particular legislation. My role with the agency is that I oversee the environmental justice unit that was a piece of legislation that was passed and signed into law in 2022, which is called Act 154. And I think an important component of that particular bill is recognizing the responsibilities of the state to pay particular attention to environmental justice focused populations and the implementation or enforcement of any law, regulation, or policy. So I really appreciate that in this particular draft, you really recognize environmental justice focused populations. One of the key components too of this piece of legislation is it directs both the advisory council and interagency council to report out investments of environmental burdens and benefits at a municipal level and a census block level. And so because environmental justice really promotes an evaluation of strategies to ensure the equitable distribution of benefits to Vermonters and environmental justice focused populations, this bill will be an important bill to keep in mind as this bill that you're working on now moves forward in terms of any litigation efforts. You're really going to have to think through the impacts of the environmental justice focused populations and the burdens that are felt by those populations because of some of our the way that we consume energy, et cetera, or even how we move forward with an implementation strategy. So one of the pieces that I can talk to is I think what provides us some pause in terms of 259 is just the timeframes and understanding kind of your comments on litigation, et cetera. I think that what is important for us to keep in mind is this resilience strategy. This is a massive undertaking for the state. It's bigger than ANR. And part of what Megan's work and the Climate Action Office's work is to do is to really wrap our arms around that state of Vermont scope of resilience work. So we really have a good understanding of what the impacts are to Vermont and who is impacted in Vermont by those efforts. And so, trying to move quickly here so you can stay on time. So I think again, what causes this pause is really that rulemaking section of the bill.
Yep.
And feeling like we're putting the cart before the horse in terms of, while trying to both, and Megan can talk to this more, is both trying to provide a really good perspective to the legislature and to the state of Vermont and working with the treasurer on what those resilience efforts could be and how much they would cost the state in order to bring us into a better space in mitigation efforts, is having rulemaking be a part of that, because part of the environmental justice law says that we are now required to have more meaningful engagement with Vermont communities that are impacted, and rulemaking, giving us a year for rulemaking. From my experience working with the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and our Interagency Council, 1 year, it feels like a lot of time, but it's not a lot of time when we're really working with community members. And so that's a space that provides us a lot of pause and that we would love to continue to work with you on.
So to be blunt,
Yeah.
The draft that came back from the agency had wonderful ideas. Most of them are incorporated in this redraft.
Yeah.
The one place where I was very concerned and spoke with Mr. O'Grady about was that there was no timeline, so there was no requirement. And while I trust this administration would probably follow through, there's no guarantee that later on a new administration might be different. So what we're looking for here, and if a year is not enough, we'll suggest another timeline, but is something in the bill that says, yes, this is going to happen. I don't want to push you to the point where you can't do your job, but on the other hand, I don't want to leave it open-ended where there's the administration could just, a new administration, for example, could just say, no, we're not going to do this, and we don't have to because there's no deadline. And the legislature would be forced to redo this bill, and then we'd lose the 2 years. And assuming that the treasurer went on with the plan to put together all this information, I don't know what we do with it.
Right.
So that's the problem of not having any date. Senator.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, and I 100% agree with Senator Sears that we want to make it doable, but I was on the summer government accountability study, and what we heard from the auditors over the last 5 years, there were more than 100 rulemaking requirements that hadn't been met. And so I think having a deadline is like really important to make sure that we are moving somewhere, but if this is the wrong deadline, we want to respect that too.
Yep. Megan, do you have any recommendations here?
Well, Megan O'Toole from the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm wondering if the committee is interested in holding to a specific timeline. The structure of rulemaking I'm thinking about maybe that we could consider is one that's in the Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires the agency to adhere to a rulemaking schedule that first has a deadline for filing with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rulemaking and then adopting subsequent to that. And if we could spend the time developing the strategy in advance of July 1, where we're at a point on July 1 to file with ICAR as opposed to actually adopting on that date, that could give us some additional time and then have an adoption date subsequent to that. That way we can start the public process and engage with ICAR at that point.
But a final date, like 2027 to implement.
So that's a good question, because once you file with ICAR, the time after ICAR to actually get to the final rule varies. You know, typically if you hit all of the milestones and benchmarks and the APA for rulemaking, the fastest you can get it done is 5.5 months. Nobody ever does that. We're very rare, very rare. Very rare.
Well, does 2027 still work for an implementation date? So that if there are gonna be lawsuits, they can take place before then? I don't wanna.
I think what the agency is saying is that they need pre-rulemaking to comply with the environmental justice law.
Okay.
And to consult with all the interested parties. And what Megan just proposed is effectively to allow for pre-rulemaking and do the APA, but it's gonna push out the date, I would probably say by a year.
To 2028?
Yeah.
Be underwater by then, so I think maybe we should try to avoid that. I'm just being snarky, sorry.
Well, I don't think you're wrong. I think the time between now and 2028 and the damage that is likely to be done is significant.
Yeah.
Well, then I would put the timeline for the damage up by a year. In other words, we had 23. We should probably go to 2024.
For the treasurer's cost assessment.
Yeah.
For the covered period?
We were also intending, obviously, to work closely with the treasurer's office in that cost assessment and hopeful that they could use the strategy to inform their cost assessment, given that the recommendations in the strategy will likely have some bearing on their ability to assess the cost.
I think if we moved all the dates, that I personally could live with that. I don't know about the rest of the committee.
And
But as long as we're looking at 2024, because that would include, who knows what's gonna happen this summer.
Yeah, I mean, I
just
think
2023 alone and the July floods, we saw over $1 billion in damages, you know, and then you look at the December floods and the August floods, and I don't anticipate it's gonna get better.
No, and I think, you know, part of kind of my role in this conversation too, outside of, you know, relying on Megan's kind of framework here in terms of what you're thinking for timing, is just recognizing that the environmental justice focused populations that we are now required by law to work more closely with, and rightly so, it's really time intensive. And so that is a really important piece of this puzzle.
I wonder if some of the others, anybody else wants to comment on this discussion of the dates?
Yes, Anthony Arpino for the Conservation Law Foundation. And just looking at your timeline, just speaking to the concern that was just voiced about the treasurer being able to make effective use of the strategy, we certainly agree with that, the groups that I've been working with. But I do see that you've actually responded to that proactively. The draft that Mike just went through flips the order from the original bill. So the strategy now in the bill as July of 2025, and the treasurer's report is due several months after. So you have created, I mean, you could add some space to that, but you have created the space for the treasurer to be able to take account of that work. And if you were going to move the rulemaking deadline out in a way that allows for meaningful engagement, I do think that's appropriate up to a point, but I agree also that increasing the cover period is important because, as the senators have recognized, additional damages will accrue as we go through the process of getting this right. And we want to make sure that we are capturing the most amount of money possible to make Vermont whole as a result of the damage that these polluters have caused.
So I'm not sure what we've just agreed to completely, but I think we're on the right track here.
Yeah.
So you need more time than what was in our redraft.
I do believe that we would need more time.
We would be willing to provide you with more time. Assume, yeah, that thing, we've been trying to get BGS to fix that thing. You didn't do anything wrong, Mike.
Never
It
did.
hasn't fallen down yet. So it is a dangerous item. Maybe we should just take it down if BGS isn't gonna come around. Anyhow, speaking of climate change. Yeah, thank you, Ben. I know this is not part of your job.
It's okay, but I'll check back in with BGS and see if.
Anyway, at least, so can you work with Mike to get some, and the advocates to get some
Yeah.
language that we can all agree with?
Yeah.
And, you know, are there other problems with the redraft?
Yeah.
From the agency's point of view,
Yeah, I think,
besides the time?
yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the biggest concern that I heard from my secretary was really just the wrapping our arms around the resilience implementation strategy and what that looks like for Vermont tied to rulemaking. And so just trying to figure out that timing and what that looks like, fully hearing what your concerns are and that you want to attach.
You know, we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
I think we're the first state to,
Yeah, I mean,
get
this
to the stage.
this is a really important piece of legislation and it's a massive undertaking
It is,
too.
and it's
Yeah.
gonna be a lot of work for the agency, for the treasurer. But this does give another legislative session to review and make changes if it's necessary.
Yeah, I think that would be the important key here is being able to, depending on what we discover through this implementation strategy exercise, is being able to pivot if we need to in an important way to help the state achieve the end goal of this piece of legislation. So I think that's what we all want to get to. We just don't know what we don't know until we have the information we need. And so I think that's the biggest concern for my secretary is having rulemaking tied to another structure that we're trying to wrap our arms around. So, but I also, again, fully hear what you're saying. So we'll work with you and with advocates and Megan we can do that quickly, understanding that.
Well, we have tomorrow morning. Do we have any time left?
Yep, so we have an hour from,
We don't have an hour.
we have 45 minutes tomorrow. Nine.
You have it.
I'm on the schedule already.
Oh, you are?
Yep, I.
You and Ben figured we wouldn't do this today?
Ben was correct.
Thank you, Ben.
We can work quickly.
So, is there anything else in here that the agency would object to?
Not that I'm aware of. Is there, were there other
I
flags?
guess I'll just reiterate as well, aside from the work that Maggie mentioned related to the development of the resilience strategy, I just also wanted to stress that the secretary had concerns in relation to the timeline, ANR's ability to also wrap its head around the cost recovery calculus and the data that we'll need to, understand and validate prior to understanding how that formula is actually going to work. And that's obviously, you know, an investigation into data and methodology and tools that might be available to the agency to conduct that work. We have not started doing that, and so that would be time consuming. And that was another reason for the report back, allowing us to have an opportunity to convey to the legislature what we have found to be feasible and appropriate in terms of coming up with that calculus.
So I want to mention that the other body gets a chance to look at this. Hopefully they won't make many changes, but they usually do. And so, I mean, there is an opportunity to continue the conversation and improve the bill. Yes.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chair. Ashlyn Doyle, I'm from the Treasurer's Office.
And well, that, you know what, my next question
I'd
was,
like to sit here.
did the treasurer's
I don't know if I want to get
office, did the treasurer's office like to weigh in?
I just wanted to piggyback briefly on Megan's comment about the work necessary to do the cost recovery calculus on the part of the Treasurer's Office. I know that it is sort of standard practice to try not to put appropriations in these policy bills, but I do feel compelled to just state for the record that the complexity of analysis that is going to be required on the part of the Treasurer's Office in order to have numbers that we can then go recover funds with on a really strong foundation is going to be beyond sort of the natural skill set that exists within the staff in our Treasurer's Office. You know, we do banking services and financial literacy and things like that. So not in, and I don't say this in any way to stop this bill from going forward. I think we've come to so much consensus on the bill. It's so exciting. It's going to probably make a crossover. But as we are thinking and coming back to you with an interim report and or working in the other body to make adjustments to the bill, we may want to think about funds coming to the Treasurer's Office to support that high quality work.
If I might ask what might seemingly be a naive question, since we're melding what was the climate resilience strategy into this bill that was already planned to be done, did you have the money to do that, the climate resiliency?
Within our office, we did have the climate implementation resiliency.
So can
we
you?
feel like we can do that, but we would have to hire probably outside consultants or actuarial analysis.
But weren't you gonna have to do that for the climate resiliency study?
Not for, there
Not for
wasn't the
cost
same cost
recovery.
recovery calculation in that
Right.
initial
Okay.
plan.
All right, so I'm happy to look at what you think you need for appropriations, obviously, but I thought we were melding the two together and then part of it was already covered in the budget.
I think that for the first phase of the work, we can absorb that, especially because we'll be partnering with A&R so heavily on the sort of first phase of the work. When it comes to our cost recovery calculation in our report, probably starting a year from now, at least, that's when we're going to need to expend some of those extra funds. So we can do some more work and we can also keep talking about it.
Yeah, it would be a highly technical expertise,
Well,
so you're right, yeah.
But
Okay.
I don't wanna overstate the role of the appropriations committee, but I'm a member of that committee. And many times we have funded certain things with the idea that the money would come back to us in the form of recovery. So if, that would be one way to fund whatever the numbers are, they would be part of the recovery of it.
Do you want to see language to that?
Yes, yeah.
So an appropriation to the treasurer.
Any appropriation to the agency or the treasurer in this bill would be part of the recovery money.
Right, any recovery would be reimbursed.
Reimbursing the state for any
cost of.
Yeah. That work for the agency?
I think so. I think if we can we can,
I think we're on similar footing as the treasurer's office,
Yeah,
that in
so-
terms of the resilience strategy, we already had plans,
Right.
to implement that work. But in terms of coming up with the cost recovery calculus, and any assistance in working with the treasurer and the damage assessment, we don't have resources to do that
Yeah.
work.
For example, when we
Yeah,
started
cost
the
recovery.
Cannabis Control Commission,
right,
set aside that, what funding we provided in that fiscal year would come back through the revenues of the Cannabis Control Commission. Obviously, they didn't have any revenues when they started.
yeah, I feel like we're on the right path forward here, and I also know this is a team sport, so can we all huddle, and then Megan can be the point of
Why
contact?
don't you all huddle, and we're gonna take a 30-minute break.
So I'll take